Gymnastics is, despite what many people think of it, one of the most popular sports in the world, but it's also one of the most misunderstood sports out there. Some people might think it's just flips, or that only girls do it, or you have to start at 3 years old to be good. And some of these things simply aren't true. We need to have more discussion around this sport. And this starts with breaking down the stereotypes around it, or the misconceptions around it. So if you'll stick with me, today I'm going to be breaking down the top 5 misconceptions about gymnastics. I hope you enjoy. Before we get into anything, I do just want to say that I'm basically just going to be talking through some of the things that I've found. These are more personal things that I've experienced over the years, and it's more going to be gymnastics in general, as opposed to specifically a discipline. Like, I know that a lot of acro gymnasts will have people say that they're just doing cheerleading, for example, or some aerobic gymnasts saying that they're just doing dance, things like that. So a lot of these things are going to be across the board or more men's artistic gymnastics specific, just because that's what I've experienced. So I can't cover all the bases, but I'm going to try and make it as across the board as possible. So we're going to start with number 5, that you have to be super flexible. What people think is that you need to be incredibly supple. You need to be able to move in every which way. And you need some base flexibility in gymnastics. 100% true, especially in disciplines like rhythmic gymnastics, renowned for needing incredible flexibility. But across a lot of disciplines, flexibility is not as important. It's great for injury prevention. It's great for making sure that you're physically capable of doing the gymnastics that you need to do. Like in men's artistic gymnastics, if you want to do a straddle catcher, for example, you need to be able to do a straddle fold, just because otherwise you can't hit the position that you need. And especially when you're learning it, you need to hit a pretty good straddle shape to actually get over the bar for the first time. Over time, it becomes less of an issue, but it's true with a lot of different things. Same with like shoulder flexibility on rings. If you don't have the prerequisites shoulder flexibility, you will not be able to do it. However, it's not the be all and end all. I know people that are incredibly inflexible, but also incredible at gymnastics. I know Harry Hepworth is a big example of this. He cannot do splits, just can't, and hasn't been able to for his entire career. And yet he's still one of the best gymnasts in the world, undoubtedly. So these misconceptions aren't always true. Sometimes have some element of truth to them, but not always correct. Gymnastics is a sport where a lot of different things matter. There are so many different aspects and components of fitness that you need to be able to be good at gymnastics. Therefore, just focusing on flexibility is not a good indicator of how good a gymnast will be. But that's enough about that one. Now move on to number 4. You need to be super skinny or small. What people think about this one is that all gymnasts are light or small or have similar sort of builds. And again, there can be some elements of truth to these, which is why they're quite low on the list. But across the board, especially in things like in places like British gymnastics, you've got a huge range of body types. You've got the tall, in air quotes, and sort of skinnier sort of build. So people like Ruben Ward, Alex Yoshinkash, that sort of type of gymnast. But then you've also got people like Courtney Tulloch and Harry Hepworth, who are shorter but built and look like rings workers, basically. So especially in men's artistic gymnastics, you get a big range of sort of body types that are suited to it. But then even in things like women's gymnastics, rhythmic, acro, you can get a lot of different body types that are suited to it. Like in acro, sometimes you'd assume that the bases are taller, but sometimes you can get bases that are shorter but are just massively strong. In tumbling, it's guaranteed that you're going to need a lot of leg strength, but that doesn't lend itself to a particular build. You get a lot of people that are a lot taller, a lot more slender, but then you've also got people who are a lot more muscular and have a bigger build. So yeah, in reality, different builds lend themselves to different events. So you've got like a shorter, more muscular build that lends itself to things like rings, but then you've got slightly taller, or not necessarily slightly taller, but slightly slimmer, that lends itself to things like high bar and pommel. And again, this is like just a generic, like surface level view. You will find exceptions in all of these things, every single one. So some people will be encapsulating what these things are saying. Some people will be skinny, some people will be small, and some people will have like the exact same body type, like the Japanese team. It's a shining example. They're all relatively small, they're all relatively slender, but they're massively strong. And that's what you assume a gymnast to be. But that's because they're the gold standard. They're the best of the best. And as a nation, They just produce gymnasts that happen to have that body type. But across the board, it's very different. And now we move on to number 3, which is that you have to start super young. Gymnastics is a very long sport. You have to be going for a while before you get really good at it. However, a lot of people, self not included, do start later and still manage to perform incredibly well. They still manage to get good results and get onto teams and things like that. The number of which age you need to start at varies depending on who you speak to. But a lot of people say it's around 3. A lot of people say it's around 5, things like that. I myself started at 1.5, like as soon as I could walk, I was in preschool. But I am not the rule. Like, just because I did doesn't mean everyone does. I know people who started at 8, 9 and went to like things like junior Euros. So there is precedent for people starting a lot later and still getting really good. And this also implies that you're talking about elite gymnastics, but not all gymnastics is elite gymnastics. The vast, vast majority of gymnasts are recreational gymnasts or amateur gymnasts, not people who are trying to do it professionally, who are trying to be the best at it. That kind of adds nuance to the question across the board as well. Because when you talk about things like, oh, you have to be super skinny or slender or small, or that you have to be super flexible, again, it depends on what you're trying to do. It depends on what your goals are. Because if your goals are just to go in the gym and have fun, it doesn't matter at all. But if your goals are to achieve a certain thing, it depends on what that thing is, depending on the apparatus, and it depends on the level, but it also depends on what you're capable of, because some people will be able to do a lot more than others, but it might not have anything to do with their body type. It might just be due to their technique, how like they mentally prepare for things, how good they are at competing up front, like competing naturally. And natural talent comes from a lot of different things. So starting young helps, and it gives you a good baseline and a foundation, especially if you've got good coaches, if you've got good preparations that you've done over those years. It gives you a lot to build on. But when you're that young, you can't do a lot of the big skills just because you're not big enough. You've not developed enough to be able to do those skills. And if someone who has a bit sort of fitness level and tries gymnastics, nothing's stopping them from actually progressing and getting quite far in the sport just because they didn't do it from 5 years old or 3 years old. You can start a lot later and still get somewhere. And again, depends on the level you're trying to be at. But that's enough of that. Next, we move on to number 2, that gymnastics is a girls' sport. I recently spoke to Joe Fishburne about a similar sort of thing on that podcast episode, and I'll link it, and he goes into a lot more detail. But he talks about how adversity is his superpower, some of the things that have happened to him and that he's had to deal with. But one thing that he does mention is constant comments in school. And that is something a lot of gymnasts can relate to. I know that I experienced it to some degree, definitely not to the same extent. It was less bullying, more just teasing. But a lot of people can be drawn out of the sport simply because they get taken the mick out of, basically. So based on a lot of the visibility of gymnastics, Olympics, media, things like that, a lot of what people mean when they talk about gymnastics is women's gymnastics, either women's gymnastics or rhythmic, things like that. And out of the 8 disciplines of gymnastics, or 10 or 11, depending on how you count, there is only one that is women's only. That is rhythmic gymnastics. It's an Olympic discipline, so it's quite high profile. Not so much in British gymnastics. British gymnastics doesn't have the strongest rhythmic program, but across the world, rhythmic gymnastics is big because it's an Olympic discipline. And because of the more feminine side of the sport that can be publicized quite frequently, boys who do gymnastics can often get teased about doing a women's sport or being gay, things like that. There are often homophobic comments that are thrown around. One personally that I got, again, it was more teasing than bullying, but one thing that I did get is that swing around a high bar there for a pole dancer. That was one thing that I got. But it's very individual, and a lot of people will experience different things. But a lot of people will perceive that this is a girls' sport or a sport for homosexuals just based on the fact that rhythmic gymnastics is female only, and a lot of the things that you see about gymnastics are women's. But in reality, men's gymnastics is a huge discipline. It's a big, big, big part of gymnastics, and it's entirely separate to women's gymnastics. We don't do the same apparatus. Like, we do vault and floor, which are the same, but vault's slightly different and floor's definitely different. Bars are different, beams different, then obviously there's pommel, rings, P-bar, high bar. So there's a big difference between women's gymnastics and men's gymnastics. But even across the other disciplines, there are men's sections and female sections, and neither are better than the other. Neither are necessarily bigger than the other. So when you call one a women's sport, it doesn't really make sense. A lot of the other disciplines maybe won't have this quite as much, because tumblers might say they do tumbling, not gymnastics. I would be very surprised if someone who did parkour, some like suddenly turned around and said they did gymnastics. Acro gymnasts do acro, but I think a lot of them would also, even as someone who does a less feminine style of gymnastics, myself, and then obviously Joe Fishburne as well, who does team gym, which is not, it's not feminine or masculine, it's not exactly gendered, still sort of experience that sort of thing. So I can only imagine how aerobic gymnasts and acro gymnasts, those sorts of male gymnasts, get comments. I spoke to Connor Keane recently. He said he'd never experienced anything like that. So again, it's very individual. He's an aerobic gymnast. I mean, it's a relatively feminine style of gymnastics for a man to do, and he hated it for a long time as a result. Not specifically because of that, but it was one of the factors. Just because it doesn't happen to everyone doesn't mean it's not necessarily an issue of perception with the sport, because I think if more people knew what we did, if more people knew how it worked, less people would be quick to judge an individual who does gymnastics. Hi guys, thanks for listening to the Game of Gymnastics podcast so far. If you've gotten this far into the video, you probably enjoy what I'm doing and you're potentially a repeat listener of the podcast. I want to bring you the best content possible so that you can enjoy what you're watching the most. As a result, I've created a Google form that you can fill out in the description below, and it will just be for a little bit of information about who you are and how I can best tailor the podcast to you and your interests. Again, thank you for listening and thank you for filling out the Google form. But now back to the episode. And before we get to number one, I do want to give a few honorable mentions. So there's quite a few of these. I mentioned a few earlier where acro gymnasts will say that they do cheerleading or things like that, or the other way around, that a woman doing gymnastics is masculine. It is, I'm sure you could get it both ways. Or it's not that physically demanding, it's not that difficult, or football's harder. I'm not going to get into it. I'm not going to get into that fully. But judging one sport against another is very difficult because you do very different things. It's like judging men's gymnastics against women's gymnastics. They're different sports, basically. One's not necessarily harder than the other. There are elements that make both harder. So I'm not going to get into which is harder. Let me know in the comments below, or reviews or whatever. Let me know which you think is harder, football or gymnastics. And I want to see what sort of responses I get. There are other issues though, like things like judging is random, which is definitely more the case across some of the disciplines. Things like aerobic, which I just learnt about. One section of their judging is quite subjective, I would call it. Not so much random, but it is subjective. But then execution difficulty is definitely not. It's more objective. Men's artistic gymnastics is scored objectively. Yes, there is things within the scoring that is directly tied to aesthetic appeal and therefore can be more of a subjective sort of thing. But in terms of the angles, in terms of the things that cause the deductions to take place, those are completely objective factors. So I wouldn't say judging is random at all. And it isn't across any of the disciplines, more so across some than others. But if you really learn the code, you will know how it's judged. You will learn that it's not random at all. There is a case to be made that some judges will be more biased towards some people, and the fact that you can't argue against execution scores, you can only appeal, you can only put in an inquiry for a difficulty score, not an execution score, which are the two parts of the final score, two main parts of the final score. The execution score, they deduct from 10. You can't argue that. But then the difficulty score, you can, because it's just the skills that you had in your routine added up to make the final score, like the start score, as sometimes we call it. And then another honorable mention would be that it's easy when you're good. And it's hard to argue with that one, if I'm honest. It's one of the hardest sports in the world, even when you're good at it, even when you're so-called talented. Some of the best gymnasts that I know, like, they struggle. They do. Someone like Joe Fraser or the aforementioned Hepworth, Courtney Tulloch, they'll struggle. They will find things difficult within gymnastics just because they are good, they are talented, they have longevity in the sport. With someone like Courtney Tulloch, he's been going for years and years and years. Just because those things are true doesn't mean that it's not a difficult sport for them just because they make things look easy. Gymnastics is about making things look easy. That's the basis of the scoring system. The closer something is to perfection, therefore the easier it looks, the better it scores, no matter how difficult the actual element is. So while it is true that some gymnasts will find some things easier than others, and it can be incredibly frustrating as a gymnast, if you're a gymnast and you find that some people seem to just get everything so quickly and you just can't seem to keep up, they get strength really easily, or they get like certain release elements easily, or they just get random skills so much quicker than you seem to. That does not mean that they are going to get miles ahead of you, because it's one thing to learn a skill, but then you also need to consolidate it. And you need to be able to put skills before and after, and then you need to put it into a routine. And while they can sometimes do those things quicker, you will be able to do it quicker on other things. You will be able to find other skills easier. This is why routines are different. This is why there's no one specific set routine that like everyone does, because different people find different skills easier. Different people find different skills easier to get consistent and in combinations, and people have different techniques, etc., etc. Therefore, people will have different routines, and people have different strengths and weaknesses. Now, I've beaten around the bush enough, but here is number one. The number one biggest misconception in gymnastics. You may disagree, but number one is that gymnastics is just talent. You're either naturally good or you're not. And in my mind, and when I've seen some people train, seen some people compete, it does seem like some people are just naturally more gifted, naturally able to do more than myself, than other gymnasts. And this ties in directly to what I was just speaking about with the honorable mention, the last one. But some people just seem to get things easier. And this comes from someone within gymnastics that has trained with the best gymnasts in Britain. And sometimes people just do seem to get things quick. People like Joe Fraser, Harry Hepworth, Zion Azari. He's mental. He can do some crazy stuff. And just because he can do that and I can't, that does not mean that he's better, that he's going to be better. He'll have other issues. With him, it's a lot of injuries. So in reality, talent is the be-all and end-all. It takes years of repetition, failure, and failing forwards, as opposed to failing and giving up. The biggest thing in gymnastics is not giving up. It's the ability to fall down, to make a mistake, but then get up and try again, and again, and again, and again. And then once you've gotten that, then you do it more. You get it consistent. You put it in combination. You try and connect it. And then you try and put skills before and after. Then you put it in a routine. And you're trying to do this with 8 skills in a routine. You're trying to do this across 6 apparatus. This is men's gymnastics, so this is a bit different, but it's true across the other disciplines. For tumbling, it's trying to get the transitions, trying to do it over and over and over again, doing it to mats on the track, and then doing it to the end of the track, or doing it on fast track first, or doing it on trampoline first, and then building your way up, like doing it to the track, to the pit, then doing it to the end of the track to a levelish landing, then doing it to the mats on the track and trying to do a roll out of it, then trying to get a whip out of it, like a whip out of it just before the end of the track. In every single discipline of gymnastics, there is this sort of trial and error aspect. And some people will get skills quicker, some people will get skills slower. But when you play to your strengths and when you are able to use the code to your advantage, it doesn't make as much of a difference. There's an old saying that I'm sure every gymnast will have heard. Probably every person has heard, if I'm completely honest, that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And it's very true. Talent is not everything. But when you've got someone who is talented and works hard, it's a different story. And it's very difficult to be those people. But if you put in the reps, if you put in the numbers, if you're able to keep going despite failure, then you're in a good place. And you can get past the people who are just talented. So those are all of the misconceptions. Those are all of the ones I thought of. There are obviously more. And I think that with gymnastics, with our sport, one of the biggest things is getting more people to understand what the sport actually is or what it isn't, because these misconceptions arise when people don't fully understand what we do, what we train for, why we do it. And as sad as it is, it's sometimes a way of pulling someone else down to pick yourself up. But gymnastics is one of the biggest sports, certainly in the country. There are a lot of gymnasts around the country. It's hard to say that with sports like football that take over the public eye and everyone talks about. But gymnastics is a big sport, but at the same time, it's also a sport that no one really talks about. It's somehow huge in participation and huge in numbers of recreational gymnasts that do it. And it's huge in the public eye in terms of being a great sport for people to learn basics of. Like, in terms of, people will constantly say that gymnastics is one of the best sports for a child to start out with because it just gives a great baseline of fitness and body awareness and things like that. A lot of people don't fully grasp what we actually do or what gymnastics actually is. People still think it's a girl sport. People still need to think you need to start incredibly young to get good elite gymnastics. People still think that you need to be an elite gymnast to be a gymnast. And that's a lot of gymnasts that will think that too. People still think that you need to be stupidly flexible or that it's just talent. And if you're not talented, then you can't get anywhere. These things aren't true. These things have elements of truth in them, but they're not true. All of these things that I've talked about, there are reasons that people believe them. People believe that it's a girl sport because of rhythmic gymnastics and because that's a female-only sport and because of the female-dominated media coverage of the sport. And people think that you just need to be massively flexible to be a gymnast because you do need to be flexible to be a gymnast, just in certain ways and not others. And if you're not, then it's not the be all and end all. People do think that it's just talent because talent is a huge part of gymnastics. You need to be able to do certain things, but being able to do certain things mean you won't be able to do others as well. You'll still be able to do them if you work hard, but talent is not everything. There are reasons people believe these things, but just because the misconceptions exist, just because people believe them, that doesn't mean they're true, and it doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. You need to listen to the people who say that these things are true. Non-gymnasts, I hope you've learned something. Hopefully this gives you a better understanding of what gymnastics actually is and who we are as gymnasts, because just because I'm a male gymnast doesn't mean I'm gay or overly feminine. Just because I'm a gymnast doesn't mean I'm overly flexible. Just because I'm a male gymnast who's an elite gymnast doesn't mean I'm hugely talented across the board. Doesn't mean I have a specific body type. I actually go against a lot of these misconceptions. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Game of Gymnastics podcast. Let me know other misconceptions that you've heard, that you've come across when it comes to gymnastics, and let me know what you thought about this episode, because we need more discussion around the sport. We need more people talking about it. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Game of Gymnastics podcast. Follow for more, like if you've enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.